Hey, everybody, and welcome to our Thursday, August 1st edition of Shank's Children's Lit Show. A couple of things I want to do today. I want to uh, go over and preview the final exam study guide, uh, even though it's not going to be due until next Saturday, a week from Saturday is when you'll take the exam. I'd like to get that out of the way. You have a very busy week next week, so I wanted to take care of the study guide today. So we're going to go over the exam, and then I do want to talk about your answers to uh, the wonder questions, the wonderful questions, as I put them. And then finally, we will preview realistic fiction, which will be our next and final genre, really, and two books that we're going to be taking a look at next week, Number the Stars and also Towers Falling, if my voice holds out this morning. So anyway, that's what's on tap. Let me give you a number first. Number 8 will be our first number. And we'll just go over the homework real quick. Everything due by midnight on Sunday. Watch this lecture and take note of the numbers like you always do, and then include those in the homework. I am going to ask you to read all of Number of the Stars. It's a pretty quick read. It's a wonderful example of historical fiction. Maybe you've read it already. If not, I think you'll enjoy it. It's a great book. It's not only a great book or a great example of historical fiction. It's just a great story. It's a very suspenseful. It's a real page turner. I think you'll enjoy it. Also, some corresponding pages in the packet: 197 to 198, 216 to 247. And then your quiz. I'm trying to keep the quizzes for the historical fiction books at a minimum because you guys have other things to do next week. But there are 5 questions that you'll see highlighted in the Number of the Stars questions in Canvas. Please answer those 5 questions for a 20-point quiz and send those to me by midnight on Sunday. And we will then discuss them and talk about Number of the Stars on Monday's lecture. Also, there are 2 student presentations in the realistic historical fiction genre. I have those posted now in Canvas, so please read those because remember, you are responsible for those presentations since the midterm on the final exam. And then I might suggest to you, you might, if you've not already, start working on your final paper. The final paper will be due by Sunday, what is it? August 11th. So a week from Sunday by midnight. So some things coming up next week. You'll be taking the final exam on Saturday, and the final paper will be due on Sunday. So if you have any questions about your final paper, a number of you have already emailed me, questions about the final paper. Are your topics good? Do you have any suggestions? That kind of thing. I'll be glad to answer any of those kind of questions. Also, sometime next week, if you want me to take a look at what you're working on so far, a rough draft or an outline or whatever, I would be glad to give feedback on that. So that's what's up for before our next video and our last week of class. And there's Charlie and me. I am in the picture. I know you're focusing on Charlie, but there I am too. 2 very handsome cats there, or at least one handsome cat, and then me. All right. So that's the homework. Let me take a few minutes to go over with you the final exam. If I can find it here. Where is it? Hold on a second. Yeah, I thought I didn't have it posted, but I do. All right, so here it is. We're going to be doing the final exam, much like we did the midterm, on Saturday, August 10th, starting, well, midnight Friday, I guess you would say, all the way through midnight Saturday night. I will have the exam posted for you to take within that 24-hour period. I will unpublish all the other relevant files like I did for the midterm. And like I said, it's very similar. Remember too, and I can't emphasize this enough, I know I've posted grades on Canvas, but you don't get the weighted aspect of the grades. And I'll just remind you that the final exam is worth 20% of your final grade. The midterm was worth 20% of your final grade. So just keep that in mind. Like the midterm, there will be 8 short answer questions. One difference in the final, though, is that there will be a question that involves several IDs from the various books that we've done since the midterm. And by IDs, I mean it might be a character name, it might be a significant place, it might be a significant detail, and you'll be asked to identify where this name or whatever came from, what book it came from, and why it's particularly significant to the story as a whole. So I didn't give any IDs in the midterm, but I am going to give some IDs for the final. But these just cover the books that we've done since the midterm. All right, a couple of the things. Most of this is not comprehensive, but there are a couple of the aspects in the exam that are comprehensive, meaning kind of covers things we've done all semester. You should still be you should still know what the general criteria and values and benefits of children's literature are. You know, we've been talking about those all summer long, or at least the last 6 weeks. Also know your literature terms, because there might be a question asking you to apply a literature term to a particular work and so on. And again, there will be IDs. So be familiar with the different characters and places and key moments from each of the books that we've done since the midterm. And you are responsible for the student midterms. I'm sorry, the student midterms, the student presentations. I'm trying to rush because I'm trying to keep these not too long. The student presentations since the midterm. And again, that includes the 2 new ones that I just published. All right, so there will be a question on the final exam about the student presentations. All right, what is it going to cover? Well, we've taken a look basically at a couple of different genres. We took a look at fantasy, so be familiar with the criteria for judging fantasy. And then obviously the 2 main works we did were The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and Charlotte's Web. Know the difference between high and light fantasy. And then in terms of the canvas or the packet, be familiar with the different notes about Narnia that you'll find on 152 to 156. And then there's an article by Pullman who had some rather negative things to say about Narnia. And I assigned this earlier. Refresh your memory about that in case I were to ask you a question about that. You know, a fair question might be, what are 3 objections Pullman has to Narnia? And what are your responses? So that might be the kind of question you might get for that. All right, again, the questions will be very similar to the ones on the midterm, what I call application questions. So you'll have to kind of know an idea or a term or know criteria and then apply it to a work that we've done in class or maybe a work that has been presented by students. So it's going to be that kind of short answer question with the exception of the IDs, like I just said. All right, as far as realistic fiction, obviously we did Bridge to Terabithia and Wonder, which we're going to talk about today. Know the different criteria for evaluating realistic fiction. You'll know the different criteria and issues. You know, these issues, by the way, prompted all of those words of wisdom and precepts that you guys came up with that we talked about the other day. And then as far as the articles that I've assigned, please look over again the Myers article, The Apartheid of Children's Literature, the article titled, Why Do We Have Multicultural Literature? And then also the article, Why Adults Should Read Children's Books. So those were articles I assigned last week. And then finally, we're going to get into this next week, excuse me. But we'll talk about historical fiction, know the criteria for judging historical fiction. And I have a note on Canvas about that. We're going to talk about that today. And then Number of the Stars and Towers Falling are the two works that we're going to do for historical fiction. All right, and then this is a note. This is just FYI. Since, first of all, we cut the summer class from 8 weeks to 7 weeks, I've had to eliminate our discussion of the two other genres that I usually cover in a 15-week semester. I usually don't spend a lot of time on them, but I do spend some time on them, and I do make the students responsible for notes I give about the genres. This will not be covered on the final for you guys because we don't have time to get to it. But just as an FYI, if you're interested in looking up poetry as a genre and some of the criteria we use to judge poetry and also biography, the packet pages there would be a nice review. So again, I'm not asking you about that on the exam. We didn't have time to go over that in class, so I'm not going to ask you to know about it. But like I said, if you want to, fulfill, or you want to kind of fill in the gaps to what we usually do in a 15-week class, those are the things I also talk about, usually in the last week of class, that we don't have time to do, sadly. We had to cut a few things. So again, you do not have to study poetry and biography, but just maybe for your own information, you might want to look that over. All right, so that's the exam. You'll have all day Saturday, the 10th, to turn it in by midnight, just like we did for the midterm, and it will be worth 20% of your final grade. All right, let me give you another number. How about 9? Number 9. A number of you pointed out in the past email that I repeated numbers last time around. So I apologize for that. I'll try not to do that this time. Getting old is a bitch, I'll tell you. I've been young and I've been old, and don't let them fool you. Being young is better, I'll tell you. All right, I do want to talk about wonder as an example, question mark, of realistic fiction. I've been looking over your comments for the quiz questions, and I paid particular attention to things that you thought perhaps were unrealistic about the book. And I tend to agree with you on just about every point you made, but I have kind of a point about that that I want to make as we cover these questions. So I guess the best way to go over the book is to cover these questions from the wonderful assignments that I gave you. All right. First and foremost, what's interesting about the book is that it does incorporate different points of view. We have different characters narrating. It's not just Augie's point of view. Jack Will gets a chapter, Via gets a chapter, Miranda gets a chapter, even Justin, Via's boyfriend, gets a chapter. And there are a number of pros to this, as you guys pointed out. I think one of the interesting things is it kind of ties in with question number 4, a description of Augie. Early on, he takes a little bit of time to describe what he looks like, but in most cases, like most stories, you're not going to have the first person narrator say, oh, by the way, I'm going to take a few paragraphs to describe myself to you. It just would seem unnatural. But of course, because his appearance is such an important part of his life and what he has to deal with, he takes a little bit of time to describe it. He says, his cheeks are punched in, his eyes are too low, he has a very small, what he calls a tortoise mouth. He has very small, misshapen ears that don't work properly, by the way, so he has to use hearing aids, etc. So that's how he describes himself. But one of the benefits of other points of view is that other characters can describe their first uh, experience with Augie and how they first felt and what they saw. And of course, Via, his sister, has lived with Augie all her life. He's the little brother that she wanted so badly and does love very dearly. But I jotted this down. I think a couple of you jotted down this quote. She says a lot of his face looked like drippings on the side of a candle. So that gives you a pretty vivid description of what this kid looks like. And so that's one benefit of having multiple points of view. Others are, of course, that you get the other kid's side of things and helps answer questions that Augie can't answer for us. The Jack Will sections help explain, how he felt when he first met Augie and how they eventually became really good friends. And then he also uh, finds out what he did to make Augie give him the cold shoulder for like several months, actually. The comments he made during Halloween when he didn't know that Augie was listening, um, and how he felt about that when he learned about that, and how they eventually rekindled their friendship after the new year, all the way to the end of the school year. So we get his perspective on their friendship. It's kind of like, yeah, I thought he was weird at first and I didn't know quite what to say or do. But I got to know him and he's a great kid. He's smart and he's funny. And I like being his friend. So that's a valid and a valuable point of view, I think, to have. Via has her perspective. And this kind of ties in with one of the questions. I think she's, after Augie, the most compelling character in the story. And, she's the older sister who has kind of had to, you know, persevere on her own without a whole lot of interaction or help from her parents, and not because they don't love her, but because he takes up all of their time, ever since he was born, and all the different surgeries he's had to go through. And her narrative, I think, is very effective and maybe might be relatable to a lot of students who might be in this situation. Not a lot of us are going to be in Augie's situation, although anybody who's maybe dealt with any kind of issue physically or appearance-wise can maybe identify with what Augie's going through. But maybe a lot of people could also identify with what Via's going through. She's kind of like the forgotten kid. And she's come to accept that. But she says, just once, I'd like them to focus on me or ask me about my day or, spend some time with me and not have them devote all of their time and energy to Augie. And I think for the most part, she's accepting of this and loves him and is good natured about this. But it is kind of interesting that when she starts her new school, she's beginning high school, she doesn't tell Justin right away, or she tells Justin she's an only child, because it's like, I'd like to have one relationship where I'm not known as Augie's sister. You know, Augie gets all the attention, and I'm kind of like the satellite. I'm Augie's sister. That's how people know me. But I'm starting a new school. A lot of people don't know me, so here's my chance to have them know me. I'm sure she's embarrassed by this. She's ashamed that she didn't admit that she had a brother, and of course she eventually does tell him. But I think her story is very compelling. Um, Miranda has a chapter, and this helps explain her situation and her story, her backstory, and unhappy family life. She talks about her summer camp situation and really kind of explains why she gave her really, really good friend Via the cold shoulder. And Via doesn't know why. Why is Miranda not talking to me? Why is she totally ignoring me? And through Miranda's narration, we get an answer to that question. So a lot of benefits to the different point of view. Obviously, Augie still is the center, and he has more chapters than anybody else. But it's interesting to get the other perspectives. And this ties into with another question I ask you. I guess I'm jumping around, but they're related. Another question I ask you is, why do you suppose Julian was not one of the narrators. Julian, the bully through, well, all of the story, really. And it was interesting to read some of your comments, and I agreed with them, and we've talked about this in previous classes. There are certain pros, I think, to not having him be one of the narrators, which probably most importantly include the fact that you don't want to give a bully a chance to somehow justify being a bully. And certainly any story he might tell would, try to justify why he's so mean to this kid when there really is no justification for being so mean to this kid. But a con would be, as you guys pointed out, it might be interesting to know his story and why we kind of saw this in our previous story, didn't we? Bridget Terabithia. We had a bully in that story, but we find out what's going on in her life that makes her such a miserable kid that she feels like she has to pick on other people. And maybe we could get some insight into why Julian is the way he is. We get some indication about that in the story. I mean, his mother seems like she's a real trip. And in the movie, even more so. Oh, and by the way, before I even go any further, I think I've said this before, I can't recommend the movie version more. I think it's one of the best movie adaptations of a book that I can think of. Very, very well cast. When I first read that Julia Roberts and Owen Wilson were going to be playing the parents, I kind of had a sick feeling in my stomach because I thought, well, those are two pretty big stars. So they're going to probably shift the focus away in the movie from the kids to the two parents. And actually, they don't. It's still the kids' movie. The parents play a little bit more of a prominent role, as you might expect, but not so much that they overshadow the kids. It's still the kids' story. It's still Augie's story. So anyway, Julian is not a narrator. A little FYI that you might be interested in. Palacio did write a sequel to the book called Augie and Me, which also is narrated from multiple perspectives. And the very first chapter is narrated by Julian. It's called Julian's chapter, where he kind of explains in a way why he was so mean to Augie. But the more important aspect of his story is what happens to him during a summer vacation where he goes to visit his grandmother in Italy, I believe it is, and learns about her experiences as a Holocaust survivor and how she was helped by someone with a lot of physical handicaps and issues. And it changes him and it makes him feel very regretful for how he treated Augie. That's it in a nutshell. I don't want to give too many plot spoilers away, but I don't know if Palacio was answering criticism. I imagine a number of people kind of probably asked her, why didn't Julian have a chapter? So she actually gives Julian a chapter in the sequel. Kind of interesting. All right. So based on various accounts, we talked about Augie and what he looks like and how the different kids react to him. Another question is, the story takes place over the course of a school year. So from the beginning, when we see Augie, who had been homeschooled all his life up to then, the mom decides that now's the time to get him into a school. The dad kind of fights the idea for a while, but he's on board. So eventually he goes to this very upscale, it sounds to me, very upper class private school, the kind of school that somebody like Jack Will has to get a scholarship to get in. And we see it all play out from his invitation by Mr. Tushman to be guided through the school by a couple of people who will become either his friends or his enemies. And, in August or early September. And then it takes place over the course of a school year till, I guess we could guess, May or June. And over the course of the school year, a number of things that usually happen in a school year become prominent in the storytelling. First day of school, obviously, is traumatic for all of us, but particularly traumatic, as you can imagine, for Augie. And he takes a lot of time describing the first day of school. Other signposts in a typical year of school. Halloween plays a major factor. Of course, that's what ends Jack, Will, and August's um, friendship for at least a while. And then at the turn of the school year, um, they get back together again to start working on that dread science project that usually is a year-ending sort of thing. And I don't know about you, but I always hated science projects. And of course, they work together and to come up with a brilliant project that wins first prize. Meanwhile, uh, Julian puts together this, volcano thing. And to be honest, the volcano thing would probably have been beyond my abilities as a kid. Um, I hated science projects. But anyway, that's the kind of thing that marks the passage of time. A few other things, you have the spring play that Via is a part of, and that usually takes place toward the end of the school year. And of course, well, I'm going to save what Miranda does for a minute. I want to talk about that another way. And then obviously, the end of the school year is shown by, the graduation ceremony. And that's pretty much um, where the story ends. Oh, and prior to that, I left out maybe the most important one. Also, if you go on a school trip or a field trip, um, in this case, they went to a nature preserve. That usually is like a year-topping sort of event. And of course, a lot of important things happen in that aspect of the story. In fact, I guess I'm jumping around the questions, but I asked you, what do you think the climax of the story is? And a number of you said, well, it's the moment when, the kids who used to be in Julian's crew, and I always forget their names, so I'll jot them down here, Amos, Miles, and Henry, actually defend him against those evil seventh graders from another school who were going to beat him up. And I think that's obviously a very significant climactic moment. But the story doesn't end there. There's still some more stuff to happen. I'm not saying you're wrong. For my money, the climactic moment would be when he does win the award at the graduation ceremony, and he goes up to the podium, and all the kids are applauding and standing. He has a great line. I'll paraphrase it. He says, "I think everybody in their lives deserves at least one standing ovation in their life," and I think that's true. And that's a nice way to wrap everything up in a nice way. And that's at the very end of the school year, obviously. Um, so a number of moments that I think we all relate to that marks the passage of time from the beginning of the school year to the end are significant in telling of the story. This also hints at one of the things that many of you thought were unrealistic about the book, and I'll defend it a little bit. A number of you mentioned that you thought that, the kids' acceptance of Augie was a little bit too quick and a little bit too sweet and nice and maybe a little bit unrealistic. I can see that point, but I think Palacio is clever in that she doesn't make it too fast. The transformation isn't all that fast. It does take place over the course of a school year. And I would argue that in that span of 8 or 9 months or whatever, sure, kids are going to react in any number of mostly negative ways toward Augie. And we see them in those opening days and weeks and months of the school year. He is able to make a few friends. He is able to make a friend of Jack Will, and Summer is nice to him, et cetera, et cetera. But for most part, the kids either ignore him or shun him or are afraid of him, or in Julian's case, make fun of him and pick on him. But I don't know. I think it's somewhat realistic that over time, as kids get used to this person who is so different and looks strange and whatever, and maybe also sees him in class or sees him in the lunchroom and sees that he's a human being who is capable of having friends, who maybe get to know him, maybe not as well as Jack Will gets to know him, but know him as he's a smart kid in science, for example. And he's very funny and he's personable. And I would think over the span of time, the the shock of his appearance would probably wear off. And after a while, you would get used to the way he looks and maybe look past the way he looks and become accepting of him as a person. And it didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen in a week or two. It took place maybe over the course of the school year, until maybe by the field trip, the school trip to the nature preserve, a lot of the kids were used to him. And it's almost like, I always make this point too. It's like, yeah, he's different, and yeah, he looks weird, and yeah, he's kind of a freak. I wouldn't use that term, but maybe they would. But he's ours. He's our freak. And nobody else had better pick on him. Maybe we still kind of pick on him, but I think that's part of the defense of him when, my God, these kids from another school start picking on him. No, that's our Augie. I think I'd like to think that's realistic, because I don't think it happened overnight. At least took place over a course of several months. Now, you could argue, a couple of you mentioned this, you could argue that the situation might have been very, very different if, after years of homeschooling, here's Charlie, he's whining at me for something, I don't know what he wants. After years of being homeschooled, if he had been placed, I don't know, in your typical public school system, inner city, the results might have been very different. They probably would have been much, much tougher on him, much, much more bullying going on, with not a whole lot of punishment for the bullies. At least in a private school, kids probably are on their best behavior because they know if they act up, they can get kicked out of school. Private schools can do that. Public schools don't really do that. So some of you mentioned, their treatment of him was maybe a little bit unrealistic. And I get that, but I think the setting sort of plays a role in that story, or that part of the story as well. All right, Via, I ask about this question. I think she's a very compelling character. She's the one, as we said, has kind of been on the outside looking in, has kind of had to persevere on her own. But I love, we talked about the school play. She has that moment to shine, doesn't she? She has that moment in the spotlight when her parents have her full attention, or she has her parents' full attention. And that's a wonderful moment for her. And this is very well done in the movie too. Like I said, the movie's great. So climax of the story, the field trip, the nature preserve. Yeah, I mean, that certainly shows that even the kids who once bullied him, of course, it's kind of convenient that Julian isn't on the trip, but anyway, even the kids who bullied him early on are now ready and willing to defend him and help him against being hurt by other kids. Or you might say, as I said, his winning the award. I think that's a big moment. Everything's been kind of leading up to that. Excuse me, I gotta stop for a second. Sorry about that. My throat was getting really dry and I had to get a drink of coffee. And this is probably a good time now, since he's made an appearance. His face is not to you, it's to me, but Charlie is now here. Hey. So I feel much better now. I'm not alone up here. It is kind of weird to teach online through Zoom. It's like, are you out there? Hello, but it's kind of nice to have Charlie as a backup, even though he doesn't do anything except just kind of sit here. All right, back to what we were doing. I think the last thing I wanted to comment on was the theme of choose kind. Mr. Brown is the guy with all the precepts, and I asked you to come up with some precepts of your own last week, and they were all real good, as we went over last week. And his very first one was choose kind. And this we see play out any number of times in the story. Some of them are directed, some of these acts are directed at Augie, obviously, but not all of them deal with Augie. Certainly Jack will choose his kind when he befriends Augie. So does Summer in those early scenes where, she sees he's sitting alone, so she sits with him during lunch period. Certainly Via chooses kind her whole life in her relationship with Augie. So, I mean, any number of kids show Augie the precept of choose kind. Even the three former bullies at the end who then befriend him and defend him, they chose kind. Um, but let's not forget, some other examples too. Miranda uh, chooses kind by pretending to be sick so that Via could take over the role in our town during the premiere because she sees that Via and Augie's parents are in the audience and hers are nowhere to be found. So that was a kind gesture that meant a lot. And of course, that rekindles their friendship, thankfully. Um, Justin shows a certain amount of kindness to Via. She wouldn't have even been in the play if Justin hadn't sort of encouraged her to do that. Any number of examples of how kids choose kind, and we see it play out in the story. And you could argue maybe that this is unrealistic, but this is my main takeaway from the story. Even if it is unrealistic, shouldn't that be what we aspire to? You know, um, maybe people don't always act this way, but shouldn't we? Shouldn't we at least try, attempt that? I think what is realistic in this story is what does happen as a result of you choosing kind. What are the effects when you choose kind? Good things happen. And I don't think that's unrealistic. You know, are all these kids maybe a little too sweet and maybe too kind? Maybe. But, I don't think there's anything wrong with kids reading a book about kids who are kind to one another. There's enough evil and whatever. There's enough bullying and bad actions toward one another in real life. Um, what's wrong with maybe sending across a story where, hey, maybe we ought to do more of this? And we see it in the world, so it's realistic on that level, but we could see a lot more of it. And I think that's the point of the story. So there are any number of precepts, all of them interesting and important, but the main theme of the story is choose kind. So let me give you another number. How about 33? 33 will be our next number. So that's Wonder. I hope you enjoyed that story as much as I did. And again, I recommend the movie if you ever get a chance. All right, the last thing I wanted to cover real quick is criteria on judging historical fiction, which is going to be our next and final genre. And I have this in the canvas. I had you take a look at this. The first, and again, I compiled these from different sources, and I'm not going to bore you with all of these. And again, some of them kind of overlap. But I thought the first one, excuse me, I am running out of voice here. The first one I got from actually a textbook for education majors. It's titled 7 Reasons I Teach with Historical Fiction. Excuse me. And this lists any number of reasons why it's a good idea to teach historical fiction. And I just want to focus on a couple of points that are mentioned or one point that's mentioned in a couple of the points, which is I really encourage, and I hope they still do this, but I think the best kind of education for kids in regards to historical fiction is to have a situation where while the history teacher is teaching a unit on, I don't know, whatever era you want to pick, the Holocaust or slavery or the Cold War or the Civil War or World War II or, you know, Watergate or whatever it is that you're teaching in history, the history teacher would teach the historical aspects of it, have them read the chapters in the history book, but also work with the English teacher and have the English teacher assign literature, fiction, that would bring these stories to life. I mean, it's one thing to read about an era in history in chapters in a history book that might have a few pictures or whatever, and pretty much gives the information and the dates, et cetera, et cetera. That can be a little bit dry, but history is storytelling, right? And I think our best history teachers, our favorite history teachers, are probably those who recognize that and knew there were stories behind every historical event, compelling stories, human stories. And hopefully they could put that across in their history lessons, but it would also help for the English teacher to back it up with, say, if the history teacher is talking about or teaching about the Holocaust, for example, maybe the English teacher could work in Number of the Stars or Anne Frank. Or if the students are a little bit older, you could start getting into things like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas or something even as vivid as Night, which I wouldn't do until high school probably. But you get my drift. Obviously, the Holocaust would be a topic. We'll talk more about this next week, but obviously it would be a topic where age appropriateness would be a very important consideration. But to have the literature teacher or the English teacher working with the history teacher on a unit, I think is a great idea. And I'd like maybe usually we talk about this in class, and some students say, no, our teachers never did that. And other students say, yeah, we would do that. And it was very effective. I can't BS with you guys or talk to you about it here, but maybe if you wanted to email me as part of your email, maybe comment on this. I'd be interested to know, did you have unit learning where, disciplines worked with each other? So the history discipline would work with the English discipline. All right, and then the other list I have is pretty straightforward. And again, I compiled them from a few different sources, and some of them overlap. First and foremost, does it tell a good story? That seems to be repeated a lot. And I think that's true in Number of the Stars. It's a real page turner. It is based in fact. It's not a real life story, but it is based in fact. The author did her research, as you will see in the afterword. So a lot of the things in the story are based in fact, but it is a fictional story. So you ask yourself, does it portray the setting realistically? Does it portray the characters and how they speak and what kind of lives they lived realistically? Does it avoid stereotypes and myths? Does it work in the historical facts in an artful way? And I think Number of the Stars does a really good job of this. Does it perhaps include a figure that actually lived in the time period? And I won't give any plot spoilers away, but there actually is I guess we'll call him a character in the story that actually really did exist in Denmark during the time of the occupation. So you'll see all of these criteria play out, particularly in Number of the Stars, I think. Fills gaps in for the reader. So like I said, it's the kind of thing that can add to your knowledge. I mean, a history book can only tell you so much. But when you put flesh and blood characters and tell their story in an entertaining, suspenseful, engaging way, like I said, all history is storytelling. So these are some of the criteria of evaluating historical fiction. So when you get to the question on Number of the Stars, which asks you to apply some of these are the criteria I'm thinking about. Okay. All right. I think that's all I have for today. I'm trying to keep these videos short. The ones next week will be even particularly more short or shorter, more short. I'm not an English teacher. But anyway, so have a great weekend. Get started on your paper, and we're heading into home. We're rounding third and heading into home now as far as the class goes. So a lot of things coming up, but we'll be wrapping things up in the next 10 days or so. So for me and for my bud here, can you look at the camera? Yeah. It's too much to ask. All right. So until next time, we will see you. Have a great day, and thank you for watching.